Put it sideways.
I feel like we should get one of those things.
Oh, really? This way.
All right, let me know when you ladies are ready.
So tired. Yep.
Okay. All right, so today we're going to talk about the brain. We're going to talk about the brain also on Thursday. Your brain is approximately 3 pounds, okay? It is got two lobes it's got two hemispheres to it. So it's got a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, okay? This thing is here is called the longitudinal fissure. That's what divides it between the left and the right sides. If you look at the brain here, we've got these folds, okay? So the folds are called gyri, and then the grooves in between are called the sulci. So we've got the gyri and the sulci. Okay? We've got the two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. We're going to talk a lot more about that. We're going to watch a video about it. Contrary to popular belief, right, and misconceptions, one side of the brain doesn't do math and the other side does like language, right? They both are involved in both. They do different things. We'll talk about that in greater detail, okay? There are 5 lobes to your brain that correspond to the bones, okay? So we've got the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and then tucked up kind of inside the brain over here, this is called the insular lobe. So make sure you know the 5 lobes of the brain. Each one of these lobes, we'll talk about in greater detail, does different things. We're going to talk about this particularly in lecture, okay? The brain can also be subdivided into different sections. So we've got the outer part of the brain here. This is the cerebrum. It is in the cerebrum where we find all of the what we would call higher or executive functions. So things like math, reading, writing, language, pattern recognition, all of that is in the cerebrum. We then have the midbrain and diencephalon. This is where most of the sensory stuff is happening, okay? So we've got the thalamus, hypothalamus, hypothalamus. We have the this thing right here, this is called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum literally means white body. So this is a highly myelinated structure. The function of the corpus callosum is to connect the 2 hemispheres, right? So this allows the one hemisphere to communicate with the other hemisphere. The thalamus and the hypothalamus are kind of where a lot of stuff gets done.
It's a bit hard to see where you're pointing to for that.
For which part?
For the thalamus and the hypothalamus.
So here's the thalamus. So this little dot here, that's called the intermediate mass of the thalamus, and then directly below it is the hypothalamus. Now let me grab a pointer real quick. Something other than my finger, okay? So this is called the intermediate mass of the thalamus, okay? And underneath it is the hypothalamus. Every type of sensory information except for smell first goes to the thalamus, okay? So then from the thalamus, it is then relayed to the appropriate, what we would call association area, okay? So the thalamus is the central relay station. The hypothalamus, we're gonna learn more about this in lecture, is kind of where is our like internal thermostat. So this is where we regulate like stuff like hunger, thirst, things like that, okay? All of that's there, okay? And then we have, so this is the, here, I'll show it on this one. So over here, we've got the pituitary gland, right, which controls most of your endocrine system. And then over here, we've got the pineal gland. We'll talk a little bit more about this in lecture, but the pineal gland is what regulates your circadian rhythms, okay? So humans are nocturnal or diurnal? Diurnal. What's the difference between, what's a diurnal animal?
Daytime.
They want to be active when it's light out, inactive when it's dark out, versus like bats, which are, bats and teenagers, which are nocturnal, right? So the pineal gland is what regulates our circadian rhythms by producing a hormone called melatonin, okay? So when there is lack of ultraviolet exposure, your pineal gland starts to produce a large amount of a hormone called melatonin. That makes you want to go to sleep. It's also in here is where we find what's called the RAS, reticular activation system. This is the part of the brain that says, okay, it's time to go to sleep, and it turns off parts of the cerebellum so that you turn off your motor system, right? So your muscles turn off when you're asleep, so you don't act out your dreams, things like that. Okay, and then we got the pituitary gland, which regulates hormonal stuff. We then have the brainstem. The brainstem is the pons and the medulla oblongata. Despite what you may have learned in the movie Waterboy, the medulla oblongata is not the seat of aggression. That's actually the amygdala, which is here inside the midbrain. The pons and the medulla oblongata are basic life support functions. So this is where our respiratory and heart rate centers are. So the part that keeps your heart and your lung going is primarily here in the pons and the medulla oblongata. Anybody here who speaks Spanish? How do you say bridge in Spanish? Bridge.
Sorry, I'm blanking out. Bridge?
Tell me you speak Spanish, you know, puente.
Oh,
Bridge.
Puente, yeah.
Puente.
Puente. I thought it was puente.
Puente, yeah, depending on which part of Spanish speaking you're from. Yeah, bridge, right? So pons is Latin for bridge, right? And then they got the medulla oblongata. So this is for all of that stuff like that, okay? So we're gonna learn more about this as the when we talk about this chapter, but different parts of the brain do different things. So in the cerebrum, right, we've got the different parts of the, we got all the executive function. In the outer kind of like quarter inch is what we find what's called the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is where most of the sensory neurons for like higher executive function are. So it's in that outer cortex is where, reading, writing, math, all of that starts happening. And right here in the brain, this is called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that develops last in humans. The prefrontal cortex doesn't really start to fully develop till typically late teens to early 20s, sometimes even into the mid 20s. So the prefrontal cortex is where things like risk versus reward, delayed gratification, things like that start to kick in. So for example, 6-year-olds playing with a basketball, and the basketball dribbles out into the street. What does a 6-year-old do? Just runs out, doesn't even stop to look to see if there's traffic, right? So so a kid of a certain age is literally incapable of thinking through the consequences of their actions. They're literally incapable of doing that. As we start to develop into an adult, right, that part of the brain starts to develop more and more, right? That's why, as adults, most of us as adults, we don't eat candy and cake and ice cream all the time, because we know it's probably bad for us. But you ask your 6-year-old, what do you want for breakfast? Ice cream, right? They want ice cream all the time, sort of thing, right? So they're literally incapable of that. Okay? So then we've got the cerebellum, okay? Literally means little brain. This white stuff that you see in here, this is called the arbor vitae, means tree of life, okay? The function of the cerebellum is to help regulate muscular action. So your cerebellum helps coordinate and smooth out muscular action. If you had damage to your cerebellum, this would cause you to be pretty clumsy. We've actually have one documented case of a woman born in China. She was having all sorts of neurological issues. She went in, she got an MRI done. She's got no cerebellum. She's a little on the clumsy side. She's not super athletic, but she can walk and talk and do all sorts of normal kinds of things. That's just yet another example of, where we find, something, we say something's like, you can't live without it, and we find somebody functioning without that thing working. And so, but damage to your cerebellum would cause lack of coordination, things like that.
Do you happen to know if she learned to walk on time, or if there was
I believe there was some delayed. I mean, I don't know much about her, but we know that she's the first documented person to not have a cerebellum, and she can do a lot of things we didn't think you'd be able to do without a functioning cerebellum. So, I think that's pretty much it. Oh, so this is the cerebral aqueduct, okay? And then this is the spinal column. This is the central canal of the spinal column. This is where that cerebral spinal fluid floats. So let's talk a little bit about the clinical significance of your brain free floating within your brain case. So your brain is not connected to your brain case, but is free floating in your brain case. What's the clinical significance of that?
It absorbs shock.
It can absorb some shock, which is a good thing, okay? So if you take physics, you'll learn that Bodies, right? So we refer to as independent bodies, right? So anything that's not connected to each other. So because your brain is not connected to your brain, right? They are moving slightly independently of each other. So you have acceleration. Acceleration is what? Change in velocity. You can have positive acceleration and you can have negative acceleration, right? So I'm driving, I don't have my seatbelt on, get into a head-on collision, and my head slams into the windshield. My skull has stopped suddenly, but what does my brain do? My brain, because it's a free-floating body, right? What does it do? Slams into the front of my skull and then ricochets off the front of my skull. It's the back of my skull, and it'll just rattle around, right? So this is why humans are especially susceptible to concussive injuries, right? So we can have concussions, and we've now found with like CTE, that was that what's the name? The guy, Will Smith movie. The guy smacked the other guy. That movie where he played the doctor, right? So we found that even with repeated subconcussive damage, that it can cause cumulative trauma over time. And that's due to the fact that the brain is free floating, right? So like, for example, like those birds that will swoop down and dive into the water, their brain is anchored to the skull, or like bighorn sheep, right? So the rams that will, butt heads with each other, their brain is literally attached to their skull so it doesn't rattle around. So those guys can slam each into each other all the time and nothing happens to them. But us, our brains are highly susceptible to damage because it's constantly rattling around due to that cerebral spinal fluid. Any questions on this stuff?
What is the advantage of free floating brain?
The advantage, there's really not one. It's just one of those kind of things where our brain evolved to be good enough that that for the most part it's one of those many flaws that we find in like the design of human beings. So I'm sure there probably is one. I just don't know off the top of my head what it is. So
What was 46 on there, that little P, the pink one again?
so this is the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is what controls most of your endocrine hormones, right? So pituitary gland produces like growth hormone, oxytocin, thyroid stimulating hormone, LH, FSH, all that stuff like that. We'll get into that when we get into the endocrine system. Yes, sir.
And then you said frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and then what was the other one?
Okay, so frontal,
Uh-huh.
parietal, temporal, occipital lobe, and then underneath here, that's the insular lobe. Insular, yeah.
Can you spell that?
INSULAR, or the correct Latin spelling would be insula. So, but insula or insular are both considered correct.
Insulation.
So that's where we get the term insulation from. Yeah, inside. Yeah, so it comes from the Latin word from insula, so or insulated. Yeah. Any other questions on this, guys?
What was the first thing you said about the first top of the, when you were talking about the longitude fissure?
Yeah, so we have got the longitudinal fissure. That's what divides between the left and the right hemispheres.
Okay.
Yeah. So they got
It's
the
just
long.
the name of the line.
Just the name of the line. Yeah.
It's
So
not a thing.
yeah. So we've got two fissures, right? So we've got the longitudinal fissure, and then we got the horizontal fissure. The horizontal fissure divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So if this was an actual brain, the cerebellum would actually be hanging down. It wouldn't actually be connected there. We'll talk more about this when we get into it on Thursday, but those meninges, right? So the meninges are, it's basically like connective tissue, right? So you'll find what's called the falx cerebri and falx cerebri. You'll actually find like the meninge actually physically separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum, and you actually find it here in the longitudinal fissure as well too. So we'll talk about the three layers of the epidural, or of the meninges. So the outermost layer is called the dura mater. Literally means tough mother. It's very strong connective tissue. We're actually going to do some dissections of sheep brains on Thursday, so you guys will actually be able to play with the meninges.
We are you.
We are.
Okay.
So you don't have to do it, but if you guys want to do, I'll do a dissection, but you guys, to demonstrate to you guys. So yeah, so this was an actual brain. This would actually be like partially disconnected from it, so you could actually like separate it from each other. So this is called the vermiform structure because it looks like a worm. So it's called the vermiform structure right there. So again, these folds are called gyri, and the grooves in between are called sulci. So the gyri and the sulci. So, and then we'll talk about these in a little bit of detail as well on Thursday, but here are what are called the cranial nerves. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So everything that happens sensory-wise or motor-wise is because of these cranial nerves. So for example, this one right here, this is called the olfactory nerve for smell. And then we've got the optic and ocular motor, right? So, so vision, right? So you actually have nerves that go from your eyes to your thalamus and then to what's called the primary visual center here in the back of the brain for vision, right? So we've got
Can you use your pencil? To
Yeah.
point?
yeah.
Thanks.
So here is this is the olfactory. Okay. Right here is the olfactory. And then right here is the optic nerve. Okay. And then we've got what's called the ocular motor tract, which is why 2/3 of what your right eye sees, or 2/3 of what your right eye sees is processed by your left hemisphere, and 2/3 of what your left eye sees is processed by your right hemisphere, because it crisscrosses right there. And then we got a bunch of other nerves here. We're not going to get into the details of those for this class. If you take 201 or 202, or you'll have to learn them, or if you go to take gross anatomy in medical school or PA school, you'll learn about them as well too. But that's all the other nerves. We will talk about a mnemonic device for them if you guys want to learn it and see. But there's different nerves in here, right? So, so for example, you can see the facial nerve, which is right there. Questions on some of these structures of the brain?
So does the sense of smell go directly to the olfactory nerves?
So the sense of smell is the only sensory input in the entire body that bypasses the thalamus and goes directly to an association area in the brain called the olfactory center in the brain. Literally every other sensation, whether it be visceral stimuli or sensory stimuli, first goes to the thalamus and then from the thalamus to the appropriate relay station. We still do not understand evolutionary why that happened, but it's true in all mammals, right? In all mammals, that the sense of smell bypasses the thalamus and first goes to the olfactory center in the brain. So that's true for humans, chimpanzees, dogs, cats, foxes, whatever, right? They all do that. We still don't understand the evolutionary function behind it, right? So where the olfactory center is right next to an area. You can't really see it on the brain, on this brain. I'll show it to you when we talk about it in lecture. It's connected to an area called the limbic system. So the limbic system is the emotional seat of the brain. That's where emotions are. So like we put you in a functional MRI, right? And we show you a picture of like a really happy moment in your life, or a picture of your kids or whoever, right? And it's a happy memory, right? We'll see a particular area of the brain light up in the amygdala, right? We ask you to think about like the saddest moment that ever happened in your life. Same area, it'll light up in a slightly different way, right? So that's called the amygdala. The amygdala,
Where is that?
The amygdala, you can't see it on here. We'll show you when we talk about it in lecture. But the amygdala is part of what's called the limbic system, and the amygdala is right next to the olfactory center. So smells and memory are highly associated with each other, right? So, right, you smell, right, something that reminds you of your grandma's cooking, right? And it might bring up memories of grandma, good, bad, or otherwise, right? So, we find that smell can oftentimes trigger memories, right? Especially like traumatic memories, things like that. So we find that a lot of times people have like a PTSD episode when they smell particular types, like especially combined with like other types of sensory kinds of things. It can oftentimes cause like PTSD trigger.
The amygdala is responsible for fear as well, right?
Correct, fear and emotion, yeah, so that's the emotional part of your brain. So especially like fear and aggression, right? So we find that like certain types of animals have like higher, like for example, alligators, right? Alligators and crocodiles, right? They've got larger amygdalas than other types of animals. That's partially explains their aggression. And we do find, like violent people, right? We do find that they have a slightly larger amygdala than less violent people, right? So we've done functional MRIs of like, people that have been jailed for, like serial killers, rapists, like people like antisocial behavior, like violent people, right? We've done functional MRIs and we found that their amygdala is slightly larger than in less aggressive kinds of people.
Does that go for like experience too? Like you can start out where it's smaller and it can grow, or is it just automatically like you're born with it?
We believe it's largely inherited genetic kind of a thing. Yeah. So you find that so people that we classify as having antisocial personality disorder, sociopathic behavior. Right. We tend to find that this stuff starts to kick in relatively early, right? So like they pick fights at school, they torture animals, they light stuff on fire, right? So the inability to impulse control, right? So like we get mad, right? And we want to punch our boss, but we don't. They have the inability to not do that, right? Somebody get upset, they beat them up, right? And they have poor impulse control. So and that is associated with a larger amygdala.
I remember hearing about a woman that had not a properly functioning
Yep.
amygdala that wasn't scared of anything.
Yep.
They tried everything they could to bring her to some kind of state of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they finally succeeded by kind of faux suffocating her. They increased the amount of carbon dioxide in her blood.
Sure.
And it actually caused a reaction in her medulla oblongata or something, her life support system.
Sure.
Kicked off some kind of reaction, but I guess
Yeah.
learning that the amygdala is the center for those really deep
Yeah.
responses.
The amygdala is part of emotion, but we find that people that have dysfunction in their amygdala, they might not feel anger or sadness or fear or other kinds of things. So functional MRIs has really kind of changed neurology and neuroscience in the last about 15-20 years. We're really starting to understand what's actually going on in the brain when we do different kinds of things, right? So we know that a depressed brain is going to light up differently than a non-depressed brain. A schizophrenic brain is going to light up differently than a normal brain. A bipolar brain is going to light up differently than a normal brain will, right? So, so we've done MRIs on serial killers and other people that we would define as abnormal, and we find that their brains light up differently than people that are quote unquote normal. But that's one of the examples. So we've we do a lot of studies on antisocial people and try and figure out what makes them tick, because if we can figure out what makes them tick, we can theoretically prevent them from being violent sociopathic people.
Hmm.
And that can't be affected by physical trauma? What about football players?
Yeah. So for example, so people with CTE, right? We start to see same thing with people with Alzheimer's, dementia, right? We start to see people that have had physical changes to the brain. We can see changes in their personality, right? So we see Alzheimer's people, late stages of Alzheimer's or CTE. We start to see them become paranoid or violent or all sorts of because there's actual changes in the brain structure which can alter brain function.
Oh, okay.
Like the football Hernandez?
Like Aaron Hernandez, the football player.
Chris Benoit as well.
Chris Benoit, lots of other people, So the first person we really studied where we know that we understood that the brain was the seat of behavior was an English worker named Phineas Gage. Has anybody here heard of Phineas Gage? So Phineas Gage was a rail worker in the 1800s in England, and they were blasting a hole through a mountain to build a railroad, to build a tunnel for a railroad. And somebody had set up blast caps, and the blast cap went off early before they cleared it out. And a steel rod went through Phineas Gage's left eye and through his brain and came out, and it basically destroyed most of his left hemisphere of his brain. Miraculously, Phineas Gage actually survived the incident, went back to work. But everybody that knew Phineas Gage before the accident and knew Phineas Gage after the accident said that the Phineas Gage after the accident was a fundamentally different person than the Phineas Gage before the accident. So that was the first document where we really started to understand that like the brain really is like determining a lot about who you are as a person, and we find that. Who's heard of Charles Starkweather? So Charles Starkweather was one of the first mass shooters in America. He killed his wife and killed his mother, and then climbed up into a tower, a clock tower at University of Texas, with a like a bolt action rifle, and shot like, I don't know, 15, 20 people. He's the reason why we created SWAT teams around the country, because they realized like there was like the local police force was not equipped to like take this guy down. They ended up having to bring in like the Texas Rangers and a SWAT and like special forces guys and stuff like that. And like he wrote like a thing about like, you know, like, I want somebody to study my brain after I'm dead. I think there's something wrong with me. And people said like something had happened like a couple of years ago, and Starkweather had started to change. He started to become a different person. And sure enough, he had a tumor kind of right there, right where the amygdala is, right? So we found that, yeah, so tumors, brain damage, things like that can fundamentally, anybody have a loved one that's had like Alzheimer's or dementia, right? And you know, you can see like grandpa's not the same person grandpa used to be now that he's in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's. Yeah, so changes in the brain structure due to tumors, damage, other kinds of things can fundamentally change who a person is. So we find that some of that stuff is there. So bigger amygdala, smaller amygdalas, bigger this, smaller that, more neuronal connections, less neuronal connections. All of that can, you know, make changes in personality and who we are as an individual. So, other questions that we got?
This is gonna be for our quiz or lab quiz? Labeling's gonna be for a lab quiz?
Labeling for the
Okay.
quiz, yeah. So.
Just the label itself, not function? Or-
Correct. Well, there'll be a few
Maybe
things
some-
about function, yeah.
Okay.
So like what does the thalamus do? What does the pons and the medulla oblongata do? Stuff like that. But yeah, it's like most of the quizzes we do, it's going to be what is it? A little bit of what do we do? Yeah. That's anatomy is mostly. Right, if you go take a gross anatomy in med school, it's going to be what is this? What does it do? So
Is this life size?
that is pretty close to true to size. Yeah.
It's a little smaller, right?
It's a little bit smaller.
Supposed to be the size of like your fist right here.
It's a little bit bigger than that, yeah. So it's about 3 pounds. So the average brain is about 300 pounds, and X amount of cc. So cool. All right, guys. Have yourselves a wonderful.